Hey folks, Casper here, movingtochicagoillinois.com. If you're new here, welcome. If you're coming back, welcome back. Today we're going to be discussing topics of death, supernatural. So if you're sensitive to these topics, maybe you might want to sit this one out. But what I'll be discussing is very interesting, so let's get right into it. In Illinois, a seller is required to disclose certain defects about a property. These are all physical defects to a potential seller. These could be defects as well as radon disclosures and lead disclosures. All of these things have to do with the physical condition of the property, and none of them have to do with the prior occupant of the property. So why would that be important? In Japan, there is a law that requires sellers to disclose whether there's been an unnatural death that has occurred at a home. These homes are considered stigmatized because of these unnatural deaths, and they can include murder, suicide, death by fire, for example, or a gas leak, or maybe most haunting, neglect. As you can imagine, these types of psychological defects, as they're called, as opposed to physical defects, can have an impact on the desirability of a home. And some of these homes will stay vacant for 20 years after such an incident has occurred. Spirituality, ghosts, bad energy, and my research and discussing the topic with friends that live in Asia, Japan, and elsewhere is treated very carefully by Eastern cultures. While I cannot make sweeping generalization about any culture, I can at least point to the fact that the legislatures in Japan decided it was important enough to require such a disclosure, whereas here in America, or at least Illinois specifically, no such disclosure requirement exists. There are some states, however, in the Union that do require such a disclosure if there had been an unnatural death that occurred in the home. But apparently in Illinois, our communities do not find it to be a pressing matter. This could be a reflection of cultural differences. These properties in Japan are called Jiko Bukken properties. And my friend Ben, which we'll talk about more later, was kind enough to help me break down the kanji for this word. The word is made up of two symbols, one symbol being for accident and the other symbol being for property. The stigma associated with these properties can lower the value, or at least the desirability, of these properties. In some areas, you'll see that these properties go for 1/4 the market value of comparable homes in the area. Whereas in more population dense areas like Tokyo that are in high demand, you'll see less of a discount, maybe a minimal one, if anything. As many of you know, shopping around with me and on your own, on my website, home prices in a lot of areas are prohibitively high for many people, especially the younger generations. So if my clients are looking in the city, maybe the Loop or Gold Coast is too expensive for them, I can always point them to less population dense areas such as Albany Park, Edgewater, that are up and coming and have a lot of affordable options as far as looking for 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom condos, or otherwise I can point them to the suburbs, which again, lower population density, more options that are more affordable than trying to squeeze your way into a already tight market downtown. On a small island like Japan, this is probably less possible. Higher population density and less room to move around means that people are going to have a harder time finding a home that is affordable. So although these Jiko Bukken properties drive down property prices and have a stigma associated with them, it certainly doesn't mean that there isn't a market for them. And in my research, I found students, young professionals, comedians, and artists generally, think about people that have a lot of passion but maybe not a lot of money, are interested in these homes because of the discounts that they can offer. Naturally, some younger folks are more likely to overlook some of these stigmas if the price is right. So as I mentioned, I have some friends that have lived in Asia for some time or have family in Asia that were able to give me some additional insight into these types of properties and people's attitudes towards them. My friend Alex from Loyola University, where I attended my undergrad, had a few things to say about spiritual practices and attitudes towards these properties, including his own experiences living at 2 of such types of properties in Japan and Macau, administrative region of China. His family engages in what is called ancestral worship, so death is not a foreign topic in their household. However, there's a time and a place for that sort of thing, and generally he explained that people don't want to discuss this sort of thing all the time every day, but there are times and places where that would be appropriate. So this influences how people interact with respect to death in everyday conversation and interaction. So for example, this concept goes pretty deep. In Japan, there's 2 words for the number 4, yon and shi. Yon is the more commonly used word out of the 2. The reason why is shi is also the word for death in Japanese. So as to not bring up death in casual conversation or discussions about math, perhaps, they use the word yon to be more considerate of the feelings of the people that they're interacting with. However, this goes even deeper. In some buildings in Japan, there is no 4th floor because of this association with death. Additionally, in Shintoism and Buddhism, the 2 primary spiritual official practices in Japan, loved ones in funeral practices will prepare bowls of rice as offerings to the dead, with chopsticks sticking straight up out of the rice. So in any other context, to do something like this would be considered rude, or maybe more accurately, inconsiderate. Think about it this way. If you prepared a bowl of rice for somebody and stuck some chopsticks in it, sticking straight up, usually that sort of thing is offered to the dead and not dinner guests. And so naturally you could see how somebody could be offended by that sort of thing. I say all of this to explain how much consideration people give to speaking about the dead and bringing up the dead in everyday conversations. And so maybe that is why it has influenced the Japanese legislature to pass such a law requiring such disclosures with respect to unnatural deaths that have occurred in properties. Alex has lived in many parts of Asia and currently lives in a stigmatized building in Macau. The building he described is beautiful, a new construction building, high-end luxury condominium. The locals call it the Versace Building because its fanciness borderlines on gaudiness. However, during the construction, a significant amount of deaths occurred, and now locals steer clear away from it due to the stigma associated with those deaths. In fact, he said, there is a 50 to 75% vacancy rate in this building. Alex was able to move in at a steep discount with his wife because the owner has no choice but to cut the rental rates of this building so people move in. It seems that sometimes, at least in some cultures, you can't put a price on overlooking a stigmatization. This was something that I really didn't consider before. So it was really interesting when Alex brought it up, because when I think of a haunted house or a house that has some kind of unnatural death associated with it and stigmatizing it, I think of an old decrepit home, spooky as we all know, but I never really considered a brand new construction. The stigmatization associated with this property occurred even before the property be considered new. It was unfinished. The owner of that building that was probably set to make a decent amount of cash renting out those units in this luxury building, well, now is in a really tough spot now that he cannot seem to rent it out at all. However, this phenomena regarding the dead is not so clear cut. Alex also lived in a building in Japan that overlooked a cemetery nearby, and it did not seem that that building carried an equal type of stigma like the new construction building in Macau. Well, the cemetery is a place where you lay people to rest, whereas the unnatural deaths that occur in some of these places, that there's a certain level of trauma associated with it, and it may be implied that that spirit is restless. That's why it carries that sort of stigma. I have another Loyola friend, Ben, who went to school there in Japan and had some things to say about Jiko Bukken properties himself. He said anecdotally, despite Shinto and Buddhist practices, most people in Japan do not believe in spooky ghosts, as he puts it. However, as in all cultures, these attitudes can vary from person to person, and so he did have a friend that was the son of a Shinto priest who had much different attitudes towards ghosts than most, as it would seem. One night, when hanging deep in the mountains of Japan, they were walking down this path and an old man came by him and his friend and said, "There are some samurai graves up ahead. Make sure to say hi to them or you'll bring an extra person home with you," implying that if they don't acknowledge the spirits of the samurai at the graves, then one of them will follow them home. Now, Ben didn't think anything of this. Just an old man maybe telling some ghost stories to get his kicks. But his friend, son of a Shinto priest, took it very seriously and suggested that they don't even go over there because nothing good would come of it. The degree of belief in the supernatural will vary from person to person, so we can't make any sweeping generalizations. But again, I can point to the fact that in Japan, disclosures about unnatural deaths are required, whereas here in the United States, in most cases, no such disclosure is required. When Ben was going to school in Tokyo, he lived next to a pretty infamous home that had a murder of an entire family occur. This murder occurred in 2000 and still is unsolved. At the time, he was living in a dorm room nearby, and him and his friend, out of curiosity, went to go and check out this home. Walking up the sidewalk, all of a sudden, they were stopped by a police officer, and this was in 2014, 14 years after the incident. The police officer stopped them and told him, "Koa wa dame," meaning you can't be here. Interesting that over 14 years have passed, and police from the Tokyo Police Department are still stationed to protect the home. The closest that we get here to such a disclosure requirement, and I'm thinking in terms of criminal activity, is the requirement that a seller must disclose if the property was ever used to manufacture methamphetamines. Now, this is mostly, again, a physical defect, and the concern is with respect to the dangerous chemicals that are used in methamphetamine production. You don't want your small children to be around residue of those types of chemicals, for example. However, I have heard of a case, a friend of a friend did get a deep discount on a rental because a death occurred in that home. So It's not unheard of here, but there is no official designation or requirement for disclosure. Using my MLS search tools, I could not find a single home that carried such a stigma. However, if asked directly, like if you were to ask the realtor or the seller themselves, they cannot obfuscate the truth. So you can always ask, but they may not know, and then they won't have to disclose. But if they do, then they will have to disclose. I'm not really sure if this is a good or bad thing, these Jiko Bukken style disclosures. For example, would you as a buyer want to know such things, or is it better to be ignorant of such facts? I think we give a lot of power to our fears, and knowing can potentially manifest into a haunting. There is the concept of a tulpa. This is a theosophical term, which is rooted in Buddhist Nirmanakaya, which are earthly bodies that Buddha manifested so he could teach those trying to reach nirvana. This concept was adopted by Western spiritualists and occultists, including Alexandra David Neal in the 20th century, who stated she was able to think beings into existence using Buddhist tulpa creation practices. Perhaps if we believe enough, we can invite such spirits into a home, and they can then cross into our tangible realm in the form of voices being heard or poltergeist type activity. At the very least, it can influence our perception of our reality, where suddenly the home shifting naturally or the neighbors moving furniture can be interpreted as ghostly activity. So with that said, do you believe that it is important enough to know these things, despite the fact that it may turn you off from a property that is otherwise totally fine? What difference does it really make? Let me know in the comments with your perspective as a buyer. And as a seller, if you are forced to make this disclosure and then to sell that property at a discount, it's very likely that if you're making such a disclosure, you're probably dealing with a lot of trauma related to the incident that requires that disclosure in the first place. So to add insult to injury to a grieving owner, family, that sort of thing, not only are you dealing with a traumatic incident that occurred in your home, but now you're selling your home at a discount, which doesn't help, certainly. All the same, again, is it important enough? Do you guys feel that it is important enough to know these things to trouble a seller like this that is going through some grief anyway? Again, some of the places in Japan that I mentioned will stay vacant for 20 years. That is a huge burden on a family. If that property is not making any kind of income and nobody's living in it, that's just a mortgage payment, or at the very least, a constant maintenance payment. Even that property that Ben came across in Tokyo, that property is falling apart. And in 2019, the Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department wanted to knock it down, but the family and their supporters appealed against it. So that's an ongoing dispute. These types of stigmas obviously have a big impact on the desirability of the homes in the market. So it's a good question to ask if that, as a public policy matter, is something that we want here. I was able to find one interesting case that regarded a dispute between a buyer and the seller over ghosts. This was a New York case. The case is called Stambovsky versus Ackley. In that case, a buyer from out of town put in an offer on a home that, unbeknownst to him, was a home that was part of a haunted tour in that town. It was advertised as haunted to local and national newspapers, and the buyer put an offer in without knowing this. However, the seller, being a good person, was adamant that the realtor disclose this even though they didn't have to. So the realtor disclosed this to the buyer, and the buyer laughed it off, saying, "Ha, I guess we'll have to call in the Ghostbusters," and thought nothing of it. Well, until a week later. The buyer then called for a private meeting with the seller to discuss these ghosts. And I imagine that the seller explained to the buyer, because she was always forthcoming about it, probably in the same way that she explained the hauntings during the ghost tours. And so she probably did an excellent job, because the buyer ended up getting spooked and wanting to back out of the deal. Keep in mind, he put down a substantial earnest money deposit in the amount of $32,500. So that was on the line if he was to back out of a deal. And I will tell you right now, as an attorney, the supernatural and hauntings, it's not a way that you can get out of a real estate contract, at least here in Illinois. But this occurred. The buyer did not show up to the closing, forfeited his earnest money, and then naturally sued the seller for 1, fraudulent misrepresentation, and 2, to get out of the contract. Thankfully, because I think the seller was being good and being forthcoming about all of this, the courts did not find that she was guilty of fraudulent misrepresentation. But after the case went into appeal, the appeals court did find that, 1, as a legal matter, and this is interesting, the house was haunted, and they determined this based on the fact that the seller did advertise the property or discuss the property with local and national newspapers as haunted. So that was enough to deem it haunted. Now, I don't know if that is a good enough standard to find something haunted in a court of law, but the other option is to send in that guy from Ghost Adventures, Zach, on the Sci-Fi Channel to figure out if a place is haunted or not. So it's not like we have many options, frankly. But anyway, the court found that this was strange enough that they allowed the buyer to back out of the deal. As far as I know, the earnest money was kept by the seller for the violation of the contract, but the court did not make the buyer purchase the home. Courts generally do not like to make people purchase homes. They will rather settle on monetary damages, and so the seller got that with the earnest money deposit being kept by her, and they called it that. But still an interesting case nonetheless. But as far as disputes over ghosts go, here in the United States, generally it's not a central point of concern in people's home purchasing process. I don't see a lot of people being worried about that sort of thing. Maybe if they look up the property and some kind of article comes up regarding some kind of traumatic incident that occurred in the home, they might want to steer clear of it, and that makes sense. But a lot of people don't really make it a big deal. I believe there was even a Malcom in the Middle episode about it where the dad freaking out about the fact that place was haunted and everybody else just being like, you're acting crazy. So obviously attitudes towards this sort of thing is different. I think it is interesting to discuss how Eastern cultures in Japan deal with the matter, because I do think that they're more careful about it or take more consideration into it, despite my friend Ben saying that most people in Japan anecdotally don't believe in spooky ghosts, as he put it. But I can't help to point to the fact that, well, first of all, the legislature did pass that law requiring such disclosures, so obviously somebody cares enough. And second, if you look at the Japanese horror catalog of movies, and if that's any indication of what people are afraid of in Japan, note that all the popular ones are all ghost stories. The Ring, The Grudge, Noroi, The Curse, that one looks pretty good, but all of them are ghost stories. In America, if we look at our horror catalog, it really does seem that Americans are afraid of Southerners, not ghosts. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Hills Have Eyes, Deliverance, as far as I understand, there's no disclosures required in any state in the union as to whether a Southerner has lived in a home. But maybe you guys feel differently. As a Southern attorney from Emory Law, I'm going to fight to make sure that no such disclosures are required. Thank you for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed researching it. If you guys have any questions about stigmatized properties, either by psychological defect or physical defect, and you're looking for a deal, come and talk to me. And then likewise, if you don't want to deal with it, there's a lot of areas in Chicago that are up and coming and in the surrounding suburbs that can offer you cheaper options so you don't have to go ghost hunting when you're house hunting. Thanks again for watching. I really appreciate it. Hit that like, subscribe button, and we'll catch you on the next one.